Hey, I'm Osman Faruqi, and this is The Drop, a culture show from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, where we dive into the latest in the world of pop culture and entertainment. I'm here with Thomas Mitchell and Mel Cambry. How you guys doing?
Better than you, it sounds like.
Yeah, if people are wondering why I sound different, I'm sick. I'm recording at home. I'm not physically with either Thomas or Mel. I'm not even physically in our Melbourne studio. You guys can't even see me as we have this recording because I'm hiding under some blankets to try and get the sound to be as good as possible as I record.
Yes, this is like a bit of a recurring theme for me today, actually, to be able to like not see you, but you can see me. I've actually come fresh from doing a chat with Pamela Anderson only 10 minutes ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yes, and I was kind of like all prepared. We had a Zoom record, and I like set up the lighting for myself. I looked pretty good, if I'm being honest. And then she logged on the call, and it was just like nothing. So I could hear Pamela, but couldn't see her, sadly. I don't know if she was also under a blanket, but we can find that out.
Were you hoping that she might, when she saw you turn your camera on, that she might turn hers on?
Yeah, the sheer power of my image, I thought, would compel her. But no, I did say to her, "Oh, it's kind of unnerving that I can't see you and you can see me." And she was like,
"I don't care.
You wouldn't want to see me. I've been out in the garden and I'm all muddy."
Oh, so you actually raised it with her. You said, "Hey, like, I can't see you. This is a bit
Well,
weird."
yeah, because I think originally I was told it was going to be a Zoom, and obviously Zoom implies that you would be able to see one another. So I logged on, obviously, with the great lighting and everything, did like a quick party pump before, like 30 push-ups, good to go. But yeah, it was an amazing chat, and that will be coming out this week. You'll be able to read that on Sunday, so yeah, keep an eye out for that one. But yes, I'm just having chats with people that I exclusively cannot look at today.
Now, you're a huge Pamela Anderson fan because I remember you telling me your story about when you were a teenager and Pamela Anderson was actually on your phone cover.
Yeah, that was one I was keeping out of the story, but it's good that it's on public record now. Yes, when I was in year 8, I loved Pamela Anderson, but for, as many year 8 boys did. But I also thought, like, I think you guys both watched it. Her documentary last year was amazing. We're going to be talking about some other documentaries today, but yeah, if you haven't seen it on Netflix, really interesting kind of perspective on her life that we hadn't seen and where she kind of lands in the pop culture spectrum. So yeah, I think she was a really, really interesting chat, or at least, her voice was very compelling from the ether. Yes, so that's out on Sunday. Give it a read.
We'll leave Thomas's teenage sort of, cultural enjoyments for another episode because we've got a big one coming up today. We're going to be getting into the controversy surrounding comedian Hasan Minhaj, who's been accused of making up or exaggerating stories that he told in his stand-up routines and the thorny questions that raises for comedy more generally. We're also going to discuss the new Australian documentary on Netflix. It's called OneFour Against All Odds, and it explores the way police have been actively suppressing the hip-hop scene in Western Sydney. And as usual, we'll have our Impress Your Friends recommendations, including a new TV show from me that I am extremely buzzed about and keen to share. But before we get into all of that, there's been some news in the world of film. Thomas, you sent me a message this morning and you could not contain your glee. What is going on?
Welcome to another extension of my perversions. So look, I love Sydney Sweeney.
Oh.
It's not a secret. And we all know that she recently filmed Anyone But You here with Glenn Powell, which comes out on Boxing Day, I believe. But Sydney has obviously been reading my fan mail and she loved Australia so much that she is coming back to film another movie here. She has joined the cast of Oscar winner Ron Howard's latest film, which is Eden. Originally it was called Origin of Species, but this is like a stacked cast. Vanessa Kirby, Joaquin Phoenix. It's also got Ana de Armas.
Jude Law, Daniel Bruhl. This is a big film.
Exactly. It's based on an unsolved mystery that unfolded on a remote island in the Galapagos. Queensland will be stepping in as the Galapagos. Queensland, famously the most versatile place to film in the universe. So yeah, that's great. Sydney Sweeney is coming back and I look forward to probably having a Zoom with her where I can't see her.
I love that you're still just a 14-year-old boy, aren't you? Like Pamela has aged out, but Sydney Sweeney, she's the new bombshell for you.
You set me up with the Pamela stuff and then I gave a really articulate answer about how great it was to talk to her for all these other reasons. And you're like, yeah, but what about your horny phone case? Anyway, yeah, that looks great. So that's coming soon.
And there was some controversy on Sydney Sweeney's Instagram because she, I think, was the first one to share the news, and people were suggesting that maybe she had broken the SAG-AFTRA strike by promoting a film, and how was this even being produced? But this film, we've confirmed, has got an exemption, which is something that the union is granting to independent productions that aren't attached to a major studio. So that's why it can kind of start being filmed and produced in November, and the actors are allowed to talk about it. So that is exciting that there are these films that are still being made. And I should say those exemptions come because those smaller studios agree to the conditions that the unions put on them. So it's all good. Everyone's getting paid. All the royalties are being, distributed fairly. There's no AI robots that we're aware of on this Eden production. So that's good news. Last week on the show, we spoke about Britney Spears' new memoir. And at that stage, we hadn't had a chance to read it yet. It's now out. Obviously, the reviews have been kind of middling, I think. I think the consensus is that there's some interesting stuff in there, but there's not that much of it, and it isn't written particularly well. But there was a lot of buzz around Michelle Williams for narrating the book in a really fun and both like deadpan at the right moment, but then dropping the right amount of sizzle when she needed to. You read the book. Any further thoughts on what we discussed last week?
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to say that the Britney impersonator came into the office, found me at my desk.
Oh, yeah. Update us on that.
Yeah. She was in Britney's snake era, so she had like the python around her neck, and she walked up and she handed over the book to me. It was a very unusual experience. I kind of thought we'd meet in the foyer, but here she was at my desk. I forced a colleague to get a photo with her. I don't think they really needed to do that, but sure. So I got the book on the day. The first thing I will say is that the prose is just so Workhorse-like. Like, it's not doing anything other than kind of saying what it means and meaning what it says. It plods along. Michelle Williams does save it a bit in the audiobook, but in some ways, some of the most ridiculous lines are kind of even more ridiculous when you hear someone say them out loud. So it's not like, the prose is very bad. The other thing is it goes at such a pace. It's like if you read Prince Harry's Spare, I know more about Apache helicopters than I have ever wanted to know in my entire life.
Yeah, he fills it up with a bunch of details of things.
So many details. Whereas this book, it's like one moment, Mickey Mouse Club, that's like 2 paragraphs. And then it's like Justin breaking up with me, that's 2 paragraphs. And then I'm the biggest selling pop star in the world, that's like a quick paragraph. So it like moves along at such a pace, but it's so surface level that I kind of was left wondering either the ghostwriter didn't get enough time with her, or they were just in such a rush to get this book out that they didn't really delve into the details. So you really notice that. But there are lots of, like, it's still fun to go back and remember moments in time. Like, I'd forgotten about their double denim at the VMAs and
iconic.
Yeah, some of those iconic moments. It's fun to hear her talk about them, even if it is very brief. Are you guys going to read it or listen to it?
I don't know. Like, firstly, I had a really weird moment of confusion earlier this week when everyone was talking about Michelle Williams, and I was thinking it was Destiny Child Michelle Williams, which would be fucking hilarious if like the kind of like, the spare in Destiny's Child had got this gig. It makes much more sense that it's the actress. I do think we kind of foreshadowed last week. I feel like I know the best bits of the book now, so I don't know if I'll be rushing to read it. Maybe once I finish Scar Tissue.
Well, Mel, I was kind of waiting on your review because there are very few books you don't love. So I thought even if you are like being a bit like hesitant on the quality of this book, that's probably not going to push me over the line, I've got to say.
I mean, I feel like you're throwing shade at my critical judgment, saying I like all books indiscriminately.
I think you are closer to that position than you are to the position of not liking a lot of books. That makes sense.
Maybe.
Your default position when you see a book is what I'm trying to say. Your default position when you see a book is to be like, this is good, let's go,
I guess I think, look, maybe there's some truth in that. But I also think even in a really bad book, you can take something interesting away from it, even if like the quality isn't, there's always something interesting that you can find.
Mel really likes books.
Okay, the last thing we need is another book podcast. So let's get on to our first big topic. It's a one that a number of listeners have actually asked us to cover on the show. It's the case of Hasan Minhaj versus The New Yorker. But who, guys, is really on trial? It turns out it's the entire institution of comedy. There you go. So Minhaj first came to fame in 2014 when he became a senior choro for The Daily Show. He released his first stand-up special on Netflix. It was called Homecoming King, came out in 2017, and it covered his life growing up as a Muslim Indian in America.
So my dad marries my mom. They come to the States, they have me in Davis, California, but my mom, she has to go back to India to finish up med school. So the first 8 years of my life, it was just me and my dad. It was just the two of us, just two brown dudes trying to make it in America, minus all the unconditional love. I gotta be real. You gotta be real. Brown love is very conditional. Like, you can't hear this in the photo, but he's like, you better get all A's. You can't hear that. You know what I mean? Like, let's be real.
The stand-up special received massive critical acclaim and it won him a Peabody Award. The next year, he launched his own weekly comedy news show called Patriot Act on Netflix. And earlier this year, it was reported that he was likely to take over from Trevor Noah as the host of The Daily Show. But then something happened. In September, The New Yorker released a story alleging the comedian had fabricated or embellished stories that he used in his comedy specials. The article received widespread publicity and sparked this conversation about the ethics of comedians and the stories they tell and the way that they tell them. Now, just last week, Minhaj released a video responding to The New Yorker with evidence he's presented describing omissions and factual errors in their reporting. So this is a messy situation that I think goes to how these stories are reported, how comedians or high-profile people in general choose to respond to these things, and this bigger question of whether comedians should be allowed to embellish or perhaps even fabricate details or stories that they tell in their comedy routines. Before we kind of tackle those, I want to get your views. I'll start with you, Thomas, on Hasan generally. Are you a fan of his comedy?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of his. I loved Homecoming King. I thought that was really funny, and that was kind of when I was in a big era of watching a lot of comedy specials, and he seemed really fresh and like he was a new voice. And then I thought Patriot Act was probably one of the more like daring and impressive shows that when, you know, like amongst all the John Olivers and everyone that was kind of coming up at the time, I thought Patriot Act really took it to the next level. And it was a very impressive feat of TV making when you really watch the show and, ironically, the research that goes into that show. So, yeah, I've always been Team Hasan, and I know when this story broke, you and I did have a bit of back and forth about it. But as a starting point, I invested in his career.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same as you. I'm not a super duper fan, and I don't follow his stuff super closely, but everything I've watched I like and see kind of. I've kept an eye on the headlines about him over the years and obviously a lot of the clips that go viral. So, yeah, I think he's a really interesting figure, and this story is very interesting to discuss.
Yeah, it's interesting. His kind of stand-up stuff is not what I would have typically enjoyed. Like, it's a little bit earnest. Like, Homecoming King is almost like a slideshow. It's like a presentation about his life as much as it is a stand-up special. But I think given his family background and my own, there's like so much relatability to it, right? He's funny, and a lot of his comedy is about growing up in a Western country as the son of migrants from a Muslim background, the aftermath of 9/11 and Islamophobia and racism and all that sort of stuff. It's always going to be hard for me to not watch someone grapple with that in a serious and comedic way and not enjoy it. So I really kind of did appreciate what he was doing. And like you, Thomas, I thought Patriot Act was really, really sharp. Like, the graphics were really smart. The way that they told stories really interesting. They covered everything from, you know, the US's cozy relationship to Saudi Arabia, India's descent into fascism, and like the way that Spotify and YouTube algorithms are changing the way hip hop is made. So it was very like my areas in terms of topics and stories that I cared about. So it was really interesting to see this all kind of blow up. And my initial thing was like, oh man, not another one of like the few guys that I really care about being taken down. And then the more I read the New Yorker story, the kind of more questions I had about the newsworthiness of this, and was really interested to see what he had to say. So let's look at some of the allegations the New Yorker article raises and his response to them. And I think we can sort of unpack it from there. So in Homecoming King, the New Yorker claims that Minhaj embellished a story about being rejected by his white prom date when he arrived at her doorstep on the night of the prom. And he tells the audience that her parents didn't want their daughter to take pictures on prom with a brown boy because they were concerned about what their relatives might think. And like when he tells that story on stage, that it really hits. Like you feel really sad for this guy who, through no fault of his own, just happens to be living in a part of the world at a particular point in time where his white prom date does not want to take him out because she's scared about being seen with a Muslim guy. Both very devastating and very relatable to a lot of people. Again, the magazine interviewed the woman at the center of this sort of claim or this story, and they reported that she turned down Minhaj, who was a friend of hers, days before the dance. So basically saying this didn't happen on prom night. He's exaggerated that story for comedic and emotional impact, but that's not actually what happened. In another example, this is his follow-up stand-up special, The King's Jester. The New Yorker reports that he tells a story about this guy called Brother Eric, who was allegedly sent to spy on his Californian Muslim community, like post 9/11 in the early 2000s, as an FBI informant. Minhaj says that he jokingly told Brother Eric that he wanted to get his pilot's license, and then in response was slammed into the hood of a car. Now, in an interview with the magazine, Minhaj says that story isn't exactly what happened. It was sort of based on a physical foul he received during a game of basketball, and that the basketball games that he played with young Muslim boys also involved middle-aged men who they thought were undercover officers. This is how the New Yorker sort of portrays the actual story versus how it was told in the comedy routine. In response to all that, Minhaj says that the New Yorker article was needlessly misleading and that it made it seem like he was faking racism when he says that it was a shifting around of details to tell stories in a particular way. He also provided screenshots of emails with the woman from that anecdote around prom in which she said that her parents have come a long way after Minhaj congratulated her on marrying a man of color. And in terms of the fake FBI informant story, he says, even though that interaction didn't happen exactly the way he told audiences, he said the goal was to highlight these real stories of people in the Muslim community who were being surveilled.
The truth is, racism, FBI surveillance, and threats to my family happened. And I said this on the record. So I'm going to do the most Hasan Minhaj thing ever. I'm going to do a deep dive on my own scandal with graphics because there was so much evidence I gave the New Yorker that they ignored that I want to show you. So,
I feel like there's a lot here, and I think jump in if you guys think my summation of this is wrong, but it seems like what the allegations sort of boil down to is not that the kind of like thrust of these stories that Minhaj was subject to racist experiences or that the community that is a part of was subject to racist and Islamophobia. They're not saying like that didn't happen. They're saying that the way he told stories with a level of specificity and detail isn't actually what happened, and therefore that is worth covering, that is worth writing about, because he is both a comedian, but also a guy that kind of is, I guess, a news reporter due to the way he tells stories in his work on Patriot Act, and therefore it's worth, I guess, fact-checking his comedy routines. Like I said, there's a lot going on. What are your immediate reactions to those allegations and his responses?
Yeah, I think, like you said, there is a lot going on that kind of blurs the lines. The fact that he does a show like Patriot Act means he can't just sit like solely in the comedian camp and then might get, therefore, a bit more leeway when it comes to, embellishing. Everyone knows comedians embellish for effect. You don't go to a comedy show and expect everything you're hearing on stage to be a whole truth. But I think Minhaj's position as, Patriot Act host, which is so grounded in facts, makes people, the bar is higher for him. Whether that's fair or not is a different issue. That's just a reality. So that's one thing I think that makes it like tricky for me. And the other thing I think is kind of what you touched on before. And this was when it first broke and you and I kind of disagreed on it. This was what I thought was a bit tricky. Like, he's not a comedian that tells a bunch of stories like in a row and, some of those anecdotes are made up. The problem is that he tells these very specific, detailed anecdotes that seem so rooted in truth, which then like raise the stakes and make the payoff so much stronger, both like whether it's, a bit of an emotional payoff or a sad payoff or a funny payoff. But it's very specific that these bits will be like 20-minute stories where the detail is so, like the color is so vivid. You're like, this is obviously a true story. So it's not like a, like quick setup, bang, payoff joke. And who cares if it's true? It's like he forces the audience, or he invests in the audience believing in the truth of this story. And that's what makes it so great. And that's why I think people were a little bit like, well, hold on, some of this stuff didn't happen. And perhaps other comedians who also embellish haven't been held to the same standard because of the way Minhaj structures his act.
Yeah, this story kind of blows my mind, and I probably don't watch as much comedy as you guys, but the comedy that I do like is his style. I like the long narrative-driven sets, but I mean, it's called a comedy set or a comedy act. Never have I ever thought that I was getting the truth when these people did their bits, and the level of fact-checking that went into this story. I think if you applied that to literally any comedian, you would find that their stories have been exaggerated or the details changed. And maybe I'm more cynical than or expect less authenticity than other people from my comedians. But I really didn't see that this is an issue particular to him, and I wasn't even surprised by the revelations that he'd tweaked details or added things or embellished. I presumed they all do that. But I will say, I think the kind of gotcha moment of people lying about autobiography is kind of a well-trodden trope. I think of James Frey, that author who wrote, was it A Million Little Pieces? And then it all turned out to be kind of exaggerated. I think we like these gotcha stories. We, obviously have a few of them in our past in Australia. Helen Demidinko winning the Miles Franklin. And there was a more recent one with a police officer kind of embellishing details about the roles he had done. I think we do like these stories and finding these kind of discrepancies between what people say they have done and what they haven't. But particularly for comedians, I don't know. Don't you expect that they all do this?
Yeah, I do, I think. But I think it's maybe the way which Minhaj has crafted his career. And so, and I do agree with you that there's no doubt in my mind that the New Yorker probably stumbled across this. It sounds like they did a fair bit of research and spoke to a lot of people, including ex-staffers, and no doubt they were like, this will be a good gotcha story that will 100% make headlines. And, it is kind of unfortunate because there are probably a million other comedians guilty of the same thing. But I don't know if that necessarily makes it not a story. And yeah, I don't know. Like Osman, you and I went back and forth when this first happened. I think Hasan's video was quite good, and I'm not surprised that. So if you guys haven't seen, it's worth going and watch. Like he's made a 20-minute kind of rebuke of the New Yorker story. It's really well done, and I think it makes some really good points. It's not surprising to me that he starts with a very evidence-heavy rebuttal to the New Yorker in regards to the prom date story.
I say that I show up at Bethany's house on prom night, but at the doorstep, her mom tells me they don't want her to go to prom with me because they'll be taking a lot of pictures, and they don't want their family back home to see her with a brown boy. Bethany's mom did really say that. It was just a few days before prom. And I created the doorstep scene to drop the audience into the feeling of that moment, which I told the reporter.
Is the doorstep moment true?
No,
did that happen?
No, it happened before. But the emotional truth remains the same.
Because that's, I think, where they were most misleading. And he provides pretty compelling evidence that really happened, in a way that the embellishment isn't relevant. Like all of the truth of that story and the racism involved in that story and is true. I think it gets weaker when it comes to the FBI informant stuff.
But can I ask, and I'm not throwing you under the bus here, but just out of interest, you write a weekly column that is ostensibly non-fiction. And do you think if we went back and fact-checked every single fact, do you think it would be wrong if you had embellished some of those comments? Like from your own perspective as a creator who is kind of putting out comedy that is entertainment but ostensibly based on your own experience, I mean, do you think it's wrong for a columnist to do that?
No, I was waiting for this.
Sorry, I am not actually meaning to catch you out. I'm curious about you.
All my column completely stands up. No, I appreciate that, and I know what you're saying, and I think where it gets interesting again is what subjects the embellishments are about. So obviously this is an emotional one for people because he's talking about Islamophobia and racism and these kind of pivotal moments in his life. And so I think there are naturally then more eyes on if his embellishment was to do with a conversation that happened with a person about an argument about a car park or whatever, something anecdotal and funny, and we wouldn't be as invested. But because it's this girl rejected me for prom because I am a Muslim, inevitably people get more invested in that. So yeah, I know what you're saying. And I do think, like, of course, there are times when I like play with timelines or conversations in order to like make the message of whatever I'm writing land better or funnier or harder. But I think unfortunately in this case, the New Yorker has probably zeroed in on it so much because of exactly what was at stake in his stories.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. And in it, maybe I'll tell you guys about my kind of journey with grappling with these ideas from reading the original New Yorker story and to like where we are now. When that story first kind of came across my feed, my initial reaction was like, really? Like the New Yorker, which is a great publication, which has an amazing, robust team of journalists and fact checkers and editors, and is very meticulous, like in this current era, is choosing to fact check a comedian's stand-up routine in the midst of him potentially being seen as the replacement for The Daily Show, right? And like, you know, The Daily Show isn't what it used to be, but it's still one of the biggest regular television comedy shows around. It would be a big deal for someone like Hasan Minhaj to get that show. There's a guy called Matt Bellany. He has a podcast called The Town. He writes for a US outlet called Puck News. He's reported that Hasan Minhaj and Comedy Central had essentially signed the deal for him to take over The Daily Show. At least Minaj's team thought that had happened. Then this New Yorker story came out and sort of everything sort of fell apart. So it sort of felt like, okay, this is a pretty heavy-handed intervention that the outcome of which is this guy who everyone thinks is pretty good at his job not getting a show because a couple of stories he told don't meet the New Yorker's fact-checking. That firstly kind of just didn't sit right with me. Then secondly, the certain kinds of people who are relishing and celebrating, like, as you put it, Mel, like people being gotcha'd, I found not great, because whilst the three of us, I think, genuinely appreciate Hasan to different degrees, there's always been this like crowd of people who don't like his mannerisms or find him arrogant and off-putting and don't enjoy the way that he sort of lectures people. I personally find that difficult to disconnect from the fact that like he is a brown guy. Like there's such a trope of the uppity brown guy who thinks that he's smarter than you and telling you what to do. And I think there's a lot of coded racism in that. Even here in Australia, when you think about someone like Waleed Ali, right? Like that's not someone that I agree with 100% of the time, but you read the comments on any story or any YouTube clip involving Waleed Ali, and it's like this arrogant guy thinks he's so much better than the rest of us. And I think a lot of that existed for Hasan Minhaj as well. So then when he was being critiqued by the New Yorker, a lot of people who had to sort of like hide in the shadows came out and were like, oh yeah, I told you this guy sucked and he was wrong all along. So that was the second part of what didn't sit right with me with this story. And then the third bit, and this is the bigger question that we've been talking about, is he not allowed to just say whatever the hell he wants to say? Like what if 90% of his stories were made up stories? Why does that matter that much? I think, Thomas, you've done a good job of explaining like why it does matter when his comedy relies on an emotional connection and a grappling of real issues to do with real events post 9/11. Like I think it's kind of incumbent on a comedian to simultaneously not pretend that this joke or this story lands because I'm conveying its truth, but actually it's not true. Like you kind of can't do both of those things. And I think as time has gone on, my thoughts on that have shifted a bit, both back and forth, because initially I was like, well, the New Yorker seems to be saying like, the general summation of their critiques are like, oh, his prom date didn't dump him because of racism. He wasn't really being surveilled. His family wasn't really experiencing Islamophobia. I'm like, the New Yorker's really out here saying to this guy that Islamophobia and racism didn't exist. Why are you talking about it? And that to me was also upsetting because the thrust of what he was saying is true. If some bits were like shifted around or exaggerated to deliver that bigger point within a comedy routine, not within like a serious essay, who really cares? But then I've also started to understand the flip of that, which is that if you are talking about issues like as serious as these, as emotionally resonant and as important for millions of people, like these kinds of issues around Islamophobia and race, you don't want to create gaps in a narrative that allow detractors or critics to say you're a liar and they're all made up, like as frustrating as it is, but that is the world that we live in. You don't want people to say, oh, things aren't actually that bad for Muslims post 9/11 because Minhaj was lying about his white girlfriend not going on prom date with him. There is like a responsibility I think you have to the community at that level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like it's annoying because I know what he was trying to do, but obviously this whole situation, like, it's like, oh, have you kind of like, has it backfired on you? I also think like, particularly with the Brother Eric stuff, so that's, him, Brother Eric is a real FBI informant, this guy named Craig, who, like infiltrated Muslim communities, like through gym, like got in touch with like young guys who were working out and stuff. And he's a real person. And he, this is the person that Minhaj used in his bit and said that, that he wanted to get his pilot license. And as it turns out, Brother Eric was actually in jail at the time. And I think, like, again, this is more of an error as a comedian, I think, is like, if you are going to embellish, don't get so specific because that's such an easy catch out. And, and again, I do think that was interesting in the rebuttal video from Minhaj. He kind of says, like, I really did, like come across informants and, I was playing these like pickup basketball games and it was an experience that me and my teenage friends had. You would see these guys and they would come and like hang out with us and they were obviously trying to, they infiltrated the local mosque and stuff. And he doesn't provide much detail. And I don't, like, I'm inclined to believe him, but I just think he kind of dug a grave for himself in choosing this very real person and inserting him into what seemed like a very real story. And then lo and behold, like when that proves not to be true, it just, unfortunately for him, it weakens the impact of the original joke, which I support. Like, I think what he was doing was the right thing, but he went about it the wrong way.
Yeah, I agree. I think the rebuttal video was pretty interesting too in another way because it kind of lifted the curtains on the journalism of the New Yorker reporter. Like the fact that he had the recordings and he showed how, quotes had been spliced together and other parts had been left out. I thought that made his side look very convincing. And, he had emails that he had sent to the New Yorker that they didn't pick up. All of that. Like I thought that actually helped his case a lot because it did show how journalists construct articles and whoever is right or wrong in this case, it shows the kind of construction that went into that piece, which I think kind of definitely helped his case.
Yeah, that brings me back to this question of like the newsworthiness or not of this whole thing. Like, I think it's interesting in a way. I'm glad that it exists because we can talk about these bigger questions. But you made this point right at the start, Mel. Like, if you did this with any stand-up comedian or any Daily Show host, you could come up with like the exact same critiques, if not more. And I take Thomas's point that Hasan Minhaj is like a little bit more of a narrative storyteller, a little bit more of a polemicist, but like Trevor Noah is a polemicist, John Oliver is a polemicist. Like these guys have throughout their careers told stories that I'm sure are embellished. I sort of like, I wonder about, again, like a publication as lauded as the New Yorker choosing to target firstly a comedian, but then be the first time we're really going in on this. It's like just happens to be the guy who could be the first Muslim guy to host the Daily Show who makes jokes about Islamophobia. That still doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah, I agree. And the piece is not a profile for which the New Yorker is obviously quite famous for. Like the angle of the piece is his mistruths, and that's all the piece is really about. I don't know, I'm kind of conflicted and maybe I haven't thought about this enough. Usually I struggle to find us, you guys make fun of me for sitting in the middle. Because I guess I can always struggle with the two sides, but I don't know, maybe
you can't see the other side on this one.
I'm struggling. Like maybe I'm too too post-truth or too like dark about the world, but I just presume everyone is lying about everything all the time and comedy.
Except for the people that give you nice reviews.
Yeah. And comedy is only...
That's a breakout quote from this episode.
But comedy is only funny. Like, life isn't just funny. Comedians put life in an order that makes it funny.
Isn't that so true? It's like if comedians are just telling you things that happen literally, that's not funny. That's just life. And if comedians make up stories that are so wildly disconnected from life, there's no relatability and they're not funny. So the best comedy forever has been bits of life that are relatable, heightened or exaggerated to be hilarious. I'm with you kind of, Mel. I'm not saying that, Thomas, to dismiss your points. I think you've done a very good job of articulating a lot of the concerns around this issue and I share some of them. But again, the more I think about it, the more I'm just like, who gives a shit at the end of the day?
Yeah, I agree. And yes, it's not like they were his comedy sets. And I understand that he plays different roles, but I think in the storytelling as he makes the difference, I do buy that difference as well. But I don't know, when you bump into people in the kitchen and they tell you some like travesty that happened to them on the way to work, I'm like, you're definitely playing that up by 50%. Isn't that just what people do? That's what a story
Yeah, but you're not handing them like
is.
$50 for them to tell you the story. I think like the difference to me, like, as I said before, is about the subject matter, and it crystallized perfectly in this kind of example that I will now give you. Here it comes. So recently I watched Baby J, the John Mulaney special, about his kind of like mental breakdown, cocaine addiction, going to rehab. I think you guys have both seen it.
I have not, but on the list.
Correct.
Okay. Well, it's really funny. You should watch it. But at some point in the special, he kind of relays this interview he did with GQ magazine in America when he was in rehab, and the telling of it is like hilarious because he's like fucking out of his mind on cocaine, and the way in which he tells how this interview goes with GQ is really, really funny because he's kind of talking about how it's like his descent into madness and everything. And then I remember watching that and being like, that's really funny, but also like, well, that's a real interview that I can go and read. So I went and read it. And the way in which the interview actually takes place is like very much not as chaotic as he makes it out in the special. And it's probably the best part of the special. And so then I Googled it, and there were a few people online being like, oh, I feel like John Mulaney kind of embellished here, and the interview's not as crazy as he makes it out to be in the special, and it's a bit unfair and stuff. But like the response to it is like a murmur compared to what's happened with Hasan Minhaj. And I guess, again, it comes back to, unfortunately, at this particular juncture, this particular point in time that we're in, especially with comedy and everything else going on socially, there are more people prepared to get more upset about the particular issues that he jokes and writes about. And so, yeah, like whether it's right or wrong, inevitably, it makes sense to me that people are like, this story that you said about people being racist to you as a young man, like didn't happen, or this story about Islamophobia at this time was misrepresented. And yeah, so I think it just comes back to ultimately the subject matter.
Yeah, and I think there are comedians like, our paper spoke to Suran Jaiman, who's a Sri Lankan Australian comedian, who's told his own kind of like comedy stories about race in Australia and that sort of thing. And he's talked about, of course, comedians should be allowed to embellish, but when you're talking about something like racism and the emotional core of an issue like that, there is this responsibility to get details right as much as possible. And I think I still don't know if I 100% agree with that, but I can see the distinction between that and something like, oh my God, tuna fish costs $28 at the airport now. That's so fucking crazy. And you go to the airport and it's like $22 or whatever, right? Like that's a slightly different, the stakes are different on that one. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And I think generally, though, the whole thing has been a really interesting kind of like flashpoint for comedy. And I feel for Minhaj because I don't think he deserves to have been like the face of this. And I really do hope he becomes the host of The Daily Show. But I thought both the like original story from The New Yorker, while a weird thing for them to go so hard on, was probably fair. And then I thought his rebuttal video was like really well done also. And, both sides have had their say. And I hope for the sake of everyone involved that that's like kind of the end of it. And perhaps like there'll be a bit more understanding on both sides. But yeah, a weird story for The New Yorker and an interesting, I guess, conversation around comedy.
And what a great summation. Thank you, Thomas.
You're welcome.
Okay, on to OneFour against all odds.
When you see home and away, you just see palm trees, beaches, sand, and we feel like that's the perspective people have on Australia. So we just thought we'd show them a different side of Australia and the life that we're living and what it's like on our side of Australia.
This doco hit Netflix last week, made it to number 2 on the streamer's most watched films list in Australia. It's directed by Gabe Gasparinatos, and it tells the story of a rap group from Western Sydney called OneFour, tells their origin story, their rise to fame, and why exactly the New South Wales police seem determined to stop them from performing. I'm saying all this like I don't know the story. I know the story very well. I covered the police campaign against OneFour back when I was at the ABC in 2019. I am actually featured in this documentary, but that is not the reason we're talking about it. Thomas, talk to me about OneFour in this film. Why do you think it's become such a big deal? It feels like it's being watched by everyone we know.
Yeah, it really is. Doing like crazy on Netflix, people that have never ever heard of like drill music. Some of my neighbors who I know have never been to Western Sydney have watched it. And so it seems to be making waves. Essentially, I guess to begin with, OneFour are like a drill rap crew. So drill is a type of rap music that come out of Western Sydney. Over the last few years, they've become kind of like this big name, buzzy act for a few reasons. Firstly, their music is great. And if you haven't listened to them, like do that. But also they've kind of become this weird face of a campaign by the police to kind of shut down music that they believe incites kind of like gang violence and that type of thing. And essentially what's happened with OneFour, they came up out of Western Sydney. A few of their members were kind of famously involved in a fight at Rooty Hill pub that did involve some of them being locked up after that. And as a result of that, then they were, famously had a national tour that was basically cancelled by the police in a kind of coordinated campaign that saw shows all around the country shut down, venues pulling out. And it felt very much like OneFour were being, locked out of playing and locked out of kind of taking their chance to improve their lives. And, that's the story that you covered, Osman. And that's kind of, I guess, lent this air of interest and mythology to OneFour and kind of led to this narrative where it's like OneFour versus the police, which seems really dramatic, but that's very much what these guys have found themselves in. They struggle to play shows. They're kind of like constantly in dialogue with law enforcement where, OneFour has become a group that cannot kind of get ahead despite their reputation building. And that's kind of where the Netflix doc Against All Odds takes us. It tells the story of OneFour and how they came to be, and also how their relationship with police has basically had them hamstrung.
And Osman, I think you've played down your role in it. You were a real highlight for me. Loved everything you said. Very insightful. Though if you're not watching it for OneFour, you're watching it for Osman.
Mel, that's very kind. There's actually a lot of friends and close people and a lot of people who I think have been very critical to not just like the story of OneFour, but the development of hip hop and that kind of music in Australia. People like How, people like Ian Eskiaskander. Like these are some of the 24 Karat Kev. These are people who, if you don't know their names, that's fine, but they are very influential into why when you go onto Spotify and you listen to the A1 hip hop playlist, for example, it sounds like the way it does. Like this documentary is about OneFour, but it's also kind of almost a Trojan horse for a story about like what the current Australian hip hop music scene is. And I think like large parts of the mainstream media have not done a great job of telling these people's story, these group stories, because OneFour, like, yeah, as you said, Thomas, they faced a lot of challenges and their members are in and out of prison for various issues. And I think their career has like stalled like up until now. And I think that's sort of reflected in the documentary, which ends in 2022. And like, there's been a lot that's happened since then, but, OneFour sort of hit a bit of a plateau, but the scene that they've helped build has become the dominant sound in Australian hip hop. This gritty drill sound that sees a lot of groups, Pacific Islanders, Pacifica people who are really dominating the Australian hip hop scene. So it is a good window into that as well. Mel, as someone who is maybe, I don't want to presume, but maybe like slightly less into drill rap
but you're
than
going
Thomas
to.
or I, I'm interested in your view on the doco and the story of OneFour more generally.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I don't really listen to drill rap often, but obviously
In between Carole King.
Obviously, as a culture editor, I am across the issues and obviously across the history of drill rap, particularly, from the Chicago scene and its influence in London as well. I thought...
Good flex there. Good on you. Yeah.
Very engaged. I thought the documentary was pretty surface and shallow, bar the insight from our friend Osman here. Like, it almost feels like a trailer if you hadn't read anything else about this issue and everyone was just saying kind of their top lines, whether that be the police or OneFour themselves. It just felt very... I don't know. It didn't feel like I was really seeing anything that I didn't know and didn't offer me too much of a behind the scene into the band. And like, you say their career stalled, but like it is hard to get your career going when members are in jail. And like some of these issues I felt like weren't really put to them. Like I'm obviously not on the police side, I think they should be able to perform and make their music. But I did think some of the issues weren't really put to them in a thorough way, in the way they could have been. And I would have just been interested to hear their answers to some of those questions.
Yeah, just for the record, Mel's wearing a Cops Are Tops shirt. So, firstly, I just want to say ACAB, and then I guess no. Look, I'm a big OneFour fan. I think it's tricky with these types of documentaries because, like, when you step out and you zoom out, like, for whether or not this was pitched to Netflix by the producing company or vice versa, but like this is a massive opportunity for both the production company and for OneFour, like globally. And I guess you have to think about like exactly how palatable you have to make a documentary like this when you know it's going to be like part of the global Netflix machine. So I think as someone who kind of knew the story pretty well anyway, perhaps I didn't get as much from it as I would have if I was going in cold. And like I said, like I literally had this guy who lives in my building come down and be like, hey man, I watched the Netflix documentary about OneFour. I saw your friend Osman in it. Like I knew nothing about this, like crazy story. And he was just like wanted to talk about it for 20 minutes. So I guess like therein lies the impact. Like he didn't know the story and now he's like so into it. Every time I see him, he wants to talk about it. So I think like they had probably an obligation, I guess, to try and tell the story that I already knew. So like they have to tell it from the start. And that maybe meant for my personal viewing experience, I was like, okay, well, I know a lot of this. But yeah, I do think there probably was also an air of like building into the mythology of OneFour and perhaps leaning into that a little bit. I think it looks amazing and I'm not surprised it's connecting with people. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great thing for OneFour, and ultimately the police don't come off looking great from this documentary. And the fact that it's trending number 2 on the Netflix charts, or it was earlier this week, it means that a whole new audience that never would have heard of OneFour, other than maybe from the news cycle, are getting introduced to them. Like, I think this is a very good, smart thing for them to have done at this time.
For sure. And because like you said, they are at a weird stage. Like I know that, like one member's been deported, another member is currently back behind bars. It's a period where they're probably not being able to be very prolific creatively. And, interestingly, the film premiered at South by Southwest Sydney, probably the best thing about the festival, like a couple of weeks ago. And, it's already been reported there was like a heavy police presence there. I think it was perhaps the only event where there were like metal scanners and dogs and stuff like that. So like this whole kind of narrative around OneFour continues to build. But I guess like Osman, for you, obviously you were involved in the production as a talking head and now you've seen it and you know the story. You've kind of been there from the very get-go, like large portions of your interview with the guys who were used in the doco. Like what's your vibe?
I guess it's hard for all of those reasons to be like completely objective on the doco. I think knowing the story really well, I wasn't expecting to sit down and like be shocked or surprised by a lot of stuff. But I've got to say, like, the amount of times that the police want to go on camera and just like admit to using their powers to suppress artistic expression is quite shocking to me. And I think the fact that they feel so nonchalant in doing that is like a real... It's like something that needs to be really interrogated in this country and in the state of New South Wales in particular. But I did feel like the fact that the story ends from like it ends 12 months ago. There is nothing about the OneFour story from the last 12 months in that documentary, I think is a blind spot. Like, I think it's probably deliberate. Like, I think there was a story these guys are trying to tell with the limitations that they've got. It is kind of like the beginner's guide to OneFour, as you said, Thomas. So it's not necessarily incumbent upon them to have this as up to date with everything that's going on and where the scene is at right now and like what the next thing could be. It's not their job to tell every single facet of it. But from my perspective, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that. But I think overall, the impact of the documentary is going to be nothing but like good. And I don't mean just for OneFour. It's obviously great marketing for them. But I mean for putting this issue of police suppression of music and hip hop on the national and international agenda. Like, I and others have been shouting about this from the rooftops. Like, when this happened in the States to NWA 30 years ago, people went to court. The First Amendment protections and freedom of speech protect hip-hop music there in a way that they don't here. We are dealing with the same things that America went through 3 decades ago, where police say that lyrics encourage violence, that people from marginalized communities shouldn't be allowed to sing about their lives or whatever, and we are not doing anything to stop that from happening. There is always a big conversation in this country about freedom of speech and like it's being suppressed and the woke mind virus means you can't say the N-word as much as you used to be able to and everything's falling apart. But when you have state institutions like the police raiding people, raiding their houses, raiding their families' houses interacting with police forces around the country and in other countries like New Zealand, putting pressure on music venues and saying, if you don't pay us hundreds of thousands of dollars in security fees, then this show can't go on or your license might get cancelled. Like that to me is far and away the far bigger threat to freedom of speech than any of this other garbage that we write about in the media. So I think if this documentary helps more people understand that, and I think this is the unique thing that Netflix can do, is if it takes that story internationally and maybe you see like big international music figures or even fucking civil rights figures look at what's happening in Mount Druitt and say, what the hell's going on in Australia? You guys are whack. I think that is a good outcome for like culture.
Yeah, 100%. And that is, I think, the power of the Netflix machine. Like there is very much a real possibility that Ice Cube could watch Against All Odds when he's sitting at home in California and be like, oh my God, this feels familiar. I'm going to fucking tweet about it. And then like, bang, you've got like a huge conversation. I'm now taking control of Ice Cube's social media patterns. But yeah, I agree. And I think that's good. But I do hope that in this week's Impress Your Friends segment, you don't recommend the documentary because that would be unfair.
Yeah, impress your friends by watching me on Netflix, guys. Thanks so much. No, let's go to our Impress Your Friends segment where we share our favorite culture recommendations from the past week. Thomas, why don't you go first this time?
Yes, just to keep things steady, I'm going to recommend a Netflix documentary about Australia.
Now, this is how you do a documentary.
Yes, so this one is Lost in Larrimah. Now, you might be familiar with the story from the Australian podcast about the small town of Larrimah, but this was actually a film that came out last year and Netflix has kind of taken it on board and split it into 2 episodes. It's currently got a 92% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is very high. So basically it tells the story of Patrick Paddy Moriarty, who went missing in the small town of Larrimah. And when I say small, I mean small. Literally, it's a population of 12, now 11, because Paddy went missing on December 16th, 2017. Essentially, it's a story where everyone in this small town is a suspect, but it goes deeper than that. It kind of looks at what happens when you're living in this type of isolation. There are very small town feuds that feel enormous. It's a really interesting story. It kind of breaks down the layers of this small town, and it kind of also gives you a history of how Larrimah came to be, a population of 12 people with a single pub and a single pie shop. Yeah, it's got incredible police evidence. I really enjoyed it. It's 2 parts. You can knock it over in a night. Definitely worth watching and then worth telling your friends about.
It is so funny. The editing in this is just, it was, I watched this after the OneFour one and this was just a treat. The skill, the way it's put together and the story is told and they bring it all to kind of contrast and juxtapose with each other. I just thought it was so good and well done.
Do you want to talk a bit, Thomas, about the team behind this and where this came out of? Because it is one of these things where you there are so many documentaries these days on streamers, on YouTube, on wherever. And I think something like this and something like telemarketers that we've talked about before, which just sort of stand out because you can tell a lot of thought has gone into the storyboarding, the narrative, the characters. And I think something like OneFour Against All Odds feels a bit more like a collage of just a bunch of clips and interviews and sort of stitched together, whereas this is masterful, elegant storytelling.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of the fact that it's made by HBO is, I guess, tells you a lot. They don't tend to attach themselves to projects that are bad, obviously minus The Idol. It's also worth mentioning that it's produced by the Duplass brothers who, Jay and Mark Duplass, both actors, I think it's Jay that's in The Morning Show. They made the movie, The Creep series, which is great. So yeah, it's really it is masterfully put together. And, we've kind of seen a million small town docos, but this one really captures the essence of it. So yeah, it's great. So that's Last Stop Larrimah on Netflix.
Mel, what do you got for us?
Look, I feel like I'm being typecast, so I'm bursting out of my box this week, and I'm recommending The Equalizer 3, which I think for you, Osman, as a sick man at the moment, this could be one for you. It's just available to rent now. Were you guys across the Equalizer series?
Love The Equalizer.
I've only seen the first one, actually, but I really enjoyed it.
This is my first introduction to The Equalizer. Robert is his name.
Whoa, so you went totally cold. You didn't see the first 2, you just went straight Raw dogged Equalizer 3.
Yeah, I thought I'm a smart cookie, might be able to pick it up. And I didn't. There were lots of because I've since gone back and watched 1 and 2, and there's a lot of the backstory I did not pick up. But now it's.
Did you do them in reverse order? Did you go 3, 2, 1? Did you go 3, 1?
I did 3, 1, 2. And I think it was the right order. 3 was probably my favorite. Then 1 was great, 2 not so great, but a great kind of cyclone scenes. The thing I like about all these films is there's some over the top massacre scene at the end of each of them. In this one, he's in Italy, which I also enjoyed. Dakota Fanning's in it, and there's a beautiful kind of final scene in some Italian mansion where a lot of people are killed. Anyway, it's great. Yeah.
You said he, but did you talk about who's actually in this movie? Did I miss that?
I apologize. His name is Denzel Washington.
And he's a young up-and-comer. We think he's going to have a big career.
He's still got it. He plays... and you know what I actually think I connected with, and you guys will enjoy this, that he's a reader. He's reading Proust in one of them. He's reading Ernest Hemingway. He's working through all these books that were on his wife's list when she died. So, I think that's actually, as a reader, I like my killers to be readers.
I love how you were doing a recommendation for The Equalizer 3 and you still managed to talk about books in the
Proust, underrated. Anyway, I think it's a really fun action thriller, good for kind of Saturday night if you don't want anything too hectic.
Yeah, or a Wednesday afternoon when you're sick and can't leave your bed.
Yeah, put it on.
What a vibe. Awesome. Thanks, Mel. So my one, right. Okay. So we all love The Bear. We've talked about The Bear. The 3 of us love The Bear. Everyone else in the world loves The Bear. Let me tell you about a little independent British film from 2021 that I know Thomas Mitchell knows about. It's called Boiling Point. If you got off on that extraordinary one-take episode from The Bear's first season, Boiling Point is for you. It's basically that spun out into an entire film. It's a one-shot feature film taking place in real time during service at a fine dining restaurant in London. It stars Stephen Graham as the head chef, and as you'd expect, things start to unravel in this restaurant. It's loud, it's stressful, it's anxiety-inducing, but it's brilliant. Anyway, that came out 2 years ago. This week, a TV series called Boiling Point, which is a continuation of the film, just dropped on Binge. It's produced by the BBC. It has the same creative team as the film. Graham's character takes a bit of a backseat. The cast is now led by his former sous chef, who's played by Vinette Robinson. The whole supporting cast is astonishing in this. The show is really, really good. It is, if you are attracted by the Bear's kind of questions around food and life and family and stress and work and all that sort of stuff, you will like this. It doesn't have that kind of wide-eyed Ted Lasso-y element of gee shucks, it's all going to work out, which I knew that you didn't love, Mel, about the second season of The Bear. It doesn't have that stuff. So it's much darker and much more intense, but I think it works. I think it works in this kind of British tone. I think everyone should watch it, and I think we should talk about it more.
Which I think we will do that next week.
I cannot wait. And your impersonations have just been on point for this episode, Oz.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Well, let's leave it there. Let's wrap it up. That was a big episode. I think we really ran the gamut of topics.
We shared some emotional truths, none of them actually true.
Can't wait for this episode to be fact-checked by The New Yorker, and we'll be forced to release a YouTube video.
As long as they just don't make their way to my Sunday column, that would be amazing.
Thomas and Mel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This episode of The Drop was produced by Chi Wong. If you enjoyed listening to today's episode of The Drop, make sure to follow us in your favorite podcast app, leave us a review, or better yet, share it with a friend. I'm Osman Faruqi. See you next week.